How's it going?
Oh, doing
Great.
great.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us, Pierre.
Thanks for coming. With the election around the corner in just a few days, I wanted to look at Donald Trump's and Kamala Harris's proposed economic policies, compare them against each other, and then see how it would benefit your average listener along the key topics that we discussed. We were going to discuss immigration, grocery prices, inflation, the housing market, taxes, and tariffs. And that way people can make an informed decision. The goal is to be as bipartisan as possible and with as little bias as possible. We'll see if we can make that happen. We all have our biases, our underlying biases, but we'll try to be as fair as possible. So let's first start with inflation. And we can ping back however you guys want to do. Actually, before we start, why don't you each tell me a little bit about your backgrounds and what you do?
Sure. So, so I'm John Soriano. Like Malcolm, I'm a professor at the University of Dallas, and we both teach economics. I particularly focus on labor economics. My areas of expertise are family policy, so things like how policy affects marriage and how many children people have. And I also particularly focus on immigration policy as well.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so I assistant professor at University of Dallas, and my background is actually in experimental economics, looking at conflict and conflict resolution. But I've been making this research goal switch to look more into topics that are more local in nature. Like, for example, let's say, what's the actual economic impact of, let's say, the new Ranger Stadium and those sort of local impacts.
Oh, that's great. That's really cool. So let's dive in and first start with inflation. So in simple terms, what is inflation?
Want to start, Malcolm?
Sure. So inflation is this idea of the overall level of prices for, let's say, goods and services. A lot of times this also includes wages as well, but more and more I see that a lot of people usually just look at goods and services and this overall price level. Now, for an individual good, there's a number of reasons why prices can, let's say, change, right? The prices can go up because, let's say, all of a sudden the Atkins diet is in vogue and beef prices raise and things like that. But that's for a specific good or a specific service. But when it comes to inflation, this would be something happening systemic in the macroeconomy that's causing this overall price level to go up.
As we've seen in the last few years.
Yes. Yeah. And there's a number of reasons why that could happen, right? It could be the old saying of too many dollars chasing too few of goods. It could be the supply chain issues that we were seeing earlier because of the pandemic. It could be all the way back from the 1970s when you had those issues where oil prices were causing these systemic issues with our economy because our economy was heavily dependent on oil back in the 1960s, something economy-wide.
So, and how much of that inflation is based on policy? Because you always have, one political candidate saying, this is my policies are why the economy is what it is today. And that's what they back their entire campaign on. So how much of it is policy driven versus just the natural ebb and flow of the markets? And I know that there's, effects like the Fed and, the interest rates that change that can affect that. But can we quantify that?
So policy is definitely important. So the decisions that different administrations make are important, but if you do look at the longer term growth of a country, it's going to be more fundamental things like the overall structure of the legal system, how well property rights are guaranteed, and whether people can trust each other, generally speaking, or not. There's a lot of cultural things, the fact that in America, we generally take it for granted that if you go into a store, you can trust that you're going to have a relatively honest person behind the cashier and you're going to be able to function relatively well. So a lot of these more broader things that would characterize the society are the longer term determinants of growth.
Yeah, it's really context specific, right? It's not something that you could just look at it as like, well, 2/3 of the time it's a policy problem, and 1/3 of the time it's something from outside, let's say the U.S., some sort of, let's say, worldwide change. It's like, for example, the inflationary issues that we had because of the pandemic. I mean, that was a policy, but I understand it was a policy to try to reduce the pandemic problems, right? And so, yeah, when you have a big shutdown of an economy, there's all sorts of things that are going to change. One of them was, let's say, supply chain issues. One of them is going to be, well, if people are, let's say, trying to make ends meet because they lost their job because we forced the economic slowdown, and you have stimulus packages, well, that can also push inflation in one way.
That makes sense, yeah. So let's break down each candidate and how they plan to tackle inflation. What are the main differences in their approaches, and how are they focusing on bringing prices down?
Mm-hmm. Well, to just make a general comment that'll kind of precede all of our discussions of specific issues, I do want to make the point that we're in a campaign right now. So the things that the candidates are going to put out are going to be somewhat different than what they're actually going to end up doing in office when they're faced with their main goal of winning the election versus actually having to work with policymakers, and then they need to deal with some of the realities a little more.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to come off probably as a little more critical of both candidates than what might actually happen, because necessarily they're going to simplify things. They're going to, well, to be frank, pander in some ways.
Sure, for sure.
And I would actually say that both candidates' policies, if they were to go in office, would need to contend more with reality and compromises that all come into place with politics. So that aside,
but wait, in regards to that, I think it's important. They are able to make certain executive orders, right? When they first come into office, are there any type of orders that they could enact? Because I'm not very familiar, and I don't know if you'll know, that they could do to actually deal with inflation in an indirect manner or direct.
Well, I would say there's things that can, let's say, shock prices, but I wouldn't say they would be doing anything that really would be fixing. Like for example, if you want to have an economic slowdown, that's a great way to go ahead and curb inflation. But there's a problem with that because you have an economic slowdown. If you have, let's say, a recession and those sort of things, that can really alleviate some pressure on prices. But hopefully they would not want to go ahead and just simply engage in a recession to fix inflation.
How would they go about engaging in a recession?
Oh, let's say they just, for example, for example, to talk about something we'll talk about earlier, let's say, let's say trying to put the kibosh on things like immigration and those sort of things, right? Can cause an economic slowdown. Now, and so what I'm getting at would be that these would almost be preposterous, right? They would maybe, let's say, reduce the overall inflationary pressures out there, but you wouldn't want to lower GDP just to go ahead and lower prices.
Right.
But to maybe add one thing to what John said too, is that there is a lot of salesmanship, just to kind of prove his, or just to support his point, would be the Inflation Reduction Act that came from Biden. That was clearly not an act that was presented to try to reduce inflation. Doesn't mean there wasn't good things in there, right? But that was clearly an act where they were actually adding more stimulus into the economy. That certainly didn't help inflation. Now, maybe it helps economic growth in the future and those sort of things, but it wasn't really an inflation reduction package.
What was the? I'm not too familiar with that. Could you explain that, the Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, I think it was, from what I understand, and John, feel free to step in, but it was mainly a package looked to, let's say, a lot of industrial policy, like, okay, the government's going to step in and, let's say, support some industries. It was another injection of, let's say, money into the economy, right? Now, in the future, these may be very beneficial things, but it wasn't doing anything to help inflation at that time. Right?
The idea was spending federal money in order to
so it was particularly targeted at green energy. So a lot of the subsidies were to try and encourage domestic production of electric vehicles, for example. And then so the line of reasoning that they would have to say it's cost reducing is that so we're going to invest and incentivize companies to develop these technologies, and then that's going to be better for the American consumer overall. And then but I would say it's more targeted at the broader goal that they wanted to reduce carbon emissions and address their environmental concerns.
I see.
And then the political topic of the discussion at the time was inflation. So to be frank, I mean, I think Biden's even kind of said this himself in hindsight, that it wasn't really so targeted at inflation, but that was a way to get it through politically at the time.
I see. So let's talk about the policies that would enact that they're talking about that would actually directly affect inflation.
So I mean, we need to kind of start about how we got to where we are. So the most recent inflation has been attributed to two main things by the economists that have studied it most carefully. One would be that because we were shutting down large swaths of the economy at a time during the COVID pandemic, and then also people were generally afraid to go into their businesses and go through things. There were a lot of disruptions in supply chains, and then there were also a lot of big shifts in consumer demand to different things. Like, so for example, since we were kept at home all the time, a lot of people started demanding a lot more construction materials and home goods to renovate their homes.
We did that.
And,
this room you're in right now was renovated during the pandemic.
So there we go. And you can't just grow trees out of thin air, for example, to get wood. So that unanticipated increase in demand increased prices by quite a bit. So then most economists would say that the majority of inflation was caused by these supply chain type issues. Now, I think the best studies would also show that the increase in government spending and also the increase in the money supply from the Fed were also drivers of inflation. So I think most of us would agree that when we were going to shut down the entire economy, that it was appropriate to pass the first big stimulus bill, the CARES Act of 2020, and then also perhaps that second stimulus bill at the end of 2020 as well. What's more controversial is the American Recovery Act of 2021, where the labor market was already kind of well on its way to recovering. There was already a vaccine. Businesses were reopening, and the Biden administration pushed that through. I think it was the headline number was $1.9 trillion. Being spent. And even at the time, there were a lot of economists more on the Democrat side of the aisle, such as Jason Furman, Barack Obama's chief economist, were saying that, given that the labor market is recovering, we probably shouldn't be spending this or at least this much. And then when you spend too much, you get the problem that Malcolm was saying, which is too many dollars chasing too few goods, and then you get inflation resulting from that. Now, so obviously there's going to be both candidates wanting to say they can do something about this. And obviously Kamala Harris is not going to say that we spent too much. So she's turned her focus to things like corporate behavior towards prices, that corporations would either explicitly or tacitly collude with each other to raise prices in a time where inflation was going up generally, and then they can get away with increasing prices more. My personal view is that I don't really see much evidence that that's really a driver there. So she likes to point to grocery price inflation, for example, where there's a lot of competition in groceries. There's a lot of different kinds of grocery stores and larger chains throughout the country. So there's a large incentive problem there, where if one was going to raise prices, they could easily be undercut by their rivals. And then there's also been some studies. One was undertaken by Biden's Council of Economic Advisors that tried to see how much of grocery price inflation could be explained by an increase in what we call markups. Markups are basically the gap between how much it costs to produce a good and the amount you're selling it for. So that's so that's kind of like could be an example or kind of a proxy for how much market power is being exploited. And even with their most generous estimates with this, they could only find that, less than 10% of grocery price inflation was caused by just it can be explained by markups, an increase in markups.
And those markups just could be, again, competition is going to hopefully drive the prices down, but the markups could be just in response to the inflation that had already happened from the pandemic, right?
Right. And then also with general inflation, consumers might be changing their purchasing behavior. So for example, so if you look at a grocery chain's balance sheet, they get things from wholesalers like, the larger brands like Kraft, but then they also sell their store brands that they produce themselves. Now, the markups on those store brands are higher than the wholesaler ones because they need to also pay the producer of it. But in that case, though, the price of the store brand would be lower, despite the fact that the markup's higher. So you could actually see that consumers, in response to more inflation, would be switching their purchasing to the store brands instead, where they'd be paying lower prices, but then the markups would appear higher in the numbers.
Right.
So it's not really clear that's an issue there. But that's something that Harris is really trying to target. Did you want to talk about housing in this part of it, or do you want to talk about housing later? Because that's another thing.
Yeah,
that
let's talk
people
about
buy.
let's talk about. Again, inflation is so general that there's so many factors that play into it. But my goal is just to, at first, what are the key? We can speak general and then get more specific as we tackle housing specifically. But what are the general policies that both Harris and Trump are proposing to help curtail inflation and bring prices down?
Well, one thing that Trump has been proposing has been, let's say, the federal or the presidential control of the Federal Reserve. Now, I don't think it's necessarily doing this to, let's say, control inflation, right? But I would say that certainly if the Federal Reserve didn't have its independence, where it can go ahead and, let's say, view the economy as things are running and then potentially affect interest rates, if they feel that if there's an economic downturn, they would want to lower interest rates to try to spur more economic activity, or if there is an inflationary problem or there's an inflation problem, to go ahead and raise interest rates to try to pull some money out of the economy. Now, that's something that the Federal Reserve does, and it does it independently. Yes, the president dictates who the new chair is going to be, but the chair operates independent of, let's say, the Senate and the president and those sort of things. Now, if President or if Donald Trump is proposing that, okay, I want to have control of the Federal Reserve, it would have an impact on inflation. I don't think he would necessarily do it to control inflation. I think he would probably do it more in terms of, let's say, maybe helping other parts of the economy that may actually cause greater inflationary issues. But certainly there's an idea that has come from that camp that would have an impact on inflation overall.
That makes sense. It seems like it would probably have a big impact. I mean, the whole point of the Fed changing the interest rates. Now, quick question, because I'm not well versed with it. The changing the interest rates, is that just purely the interest rates of the housing market specifically, or what when the interest rates are changing, what exactly is that affecting? Because I've heard this the Fed, the big Fed is changing its interest rates. What is that? What are they changing the interest rates of?
Yeah. So what the Federal Reserve does is that they affect something called, or their target interest rate. When they talk interest rates, they're talking about something called the federal funds rate. Now, what the federal funds rate is this price of obtaining loans, and it's between banks and banks primarily. Say you have the larger banks in the U.S. economy, like the Goldman Sachs, and they lend out to, let's say, other banks. And, eventually this would be lent out to consumers for housing, but also for businesses. It's not just simply housing.
Any type of lending.
Personal business
Another
loans.
big one is car loans as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so what the Federal Reserve does is that they can manipulate this federal funds rate. That's actually a market determined rate, but what they do is that they can determine the bounds. And the main bound they're looking at is the lower bound called the interest on reserve balances rate. Now, what is that rate? Well, we have of our really large banks that are out there, the Federal Reserve pays a certain amount of interest for their reserves. And all the reserve is basically what the bank is holding back. Right? They have a whole stock of money. They're going to hold back some of that money and not make loans on that. Well, the Federal Reserve pays an interest rate on that amount that they're holding back. Okay. Now, if the interest rate is really low, the Federal Reserve really wants to have a very low rate. Okay. Well, they set the interest on overnight reserve the interest on reserve balances rate to be very, very low.
I see.
Okay. And what that does is that if banks are saying, well, we're hardly making anything on our reserves, this would induce us to make more loans, injecting more money into the economy, which would be the idea if there's like a recession and they're worried about the economic wheels, let's say, slipping and not performing very well. Now,
And this would incentivize like your average person to be able to buy something and not have, because the interest rates are lower for them.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. Now, the opposite would be when you're trying to deal with inflation is that, well, we're going to go ahead and try to bump up this interest on reserve balances rate. Okay.
I see.
And so this would push up this federal funds rate, which is the rate that banks charge one another, basically saying, look, if it's that much more attractive because I'm earning a higher interest rate just holding back my money, then they're going to cut back on the amount of loans that they would offer, which reduces the total amount of money into the economy to try to deal with inflation.
Yeah, I would imagine that if Trump were to do something like that, being able to regulate and control that would have a huge effect on the prices of goods. Or inflation and the way the market would change.
It seems like the cases, and I don't know what John would say about this, but when you look at, let's say, the particular cases when inflation has absolutely gone out of control, when you had these hyperinflation issues where the entire economy has seized, the Argentina has had these issues, and Venezuela, and you have Mozambique and these countries that have had these issues, it's almost always because whatever the leader at that time, to put that generous, I don't know if that'd be a dictator or president, but whatever, right? The leader at that time had control over the monetary policy of that country, right? And so that's the scary thing, I would say, for a lot of economists would be if you have the president, that one person having that control over the Fed as well as the fiscal policy side.
But the idea is the Fed, that the interest rate of the Fed is probably the largest driving factor of the price of goods. Then we could say. I mean, I don't know how could you quantify that. I'm sure it's very hard to, but would you argue that that's probably the biggest quantifying factor of inflation?
Well, I would say in terms of the change of prices, like inflation, yes, right, or at least maybe better stated would be that this is the best lever to use to try to combat inflation when you are in an inflationary issue. As long as the inflationary issue isn't coming from, for example, if it's purely supply chain issues or if it's purely the price of oil in the 1970s, right? There's limits to how appropriate monetary policy would be in dealing with those issues, right? Because especially like supply chain, right? I mean, eventually these supply chain problems would work themselves out as the economy recovers. Do you really want to necessarily monkey with the money supply to, let's say, try to fix that other than just simply fixing supply chain? But if it's a stimulus package problem, right, there's just too many dollars out there in the economy, well, then the Federal Reserve would be the appropriate handle to try to pull to try to alleviate the inflationary issues.
And then on the fiscal side, Congress could choose to either decrease government spending or increase taxes. Multiple
levers, but one of them is much more effective, right?
Yeah. So then, I mean, there's a lot less politics involved with the monetary side of that, and that's kind of one of the benefits. Where there's a lot of other reasons why you'd want to change tax policy or change spending policy that aren't just related directly to inflation. And then, in fact, I mean, because the Congress and the president are more politically accountable, it's hardly ever a popular thing to raise taxes or decrease spending. So that's generally not going to happen as reliably or promptly when there are episodes of inflation or economic downturns.
Especially how aggressive the Federal Reserve was in raising interest rates for that span, right? I mean, they realized that there was a significant problem that they had to curb, right? And it would be difficult to think that from a fiscal or from a like a Congress and president side that would be addressed anywhere near as quickly.
Yeah, so to bring it back to the candidates a little more specifically, so I think Harris's proposed policies would be targeting corporate behavior and trying to make it so businesses don't have too much market power, and then could to use like her proposal's word, to excessively raise prices. And then we'll get into that later, but I think she would want to try and decrease housing prices through some of her policies that she's proposed. And then I think on the Trump side, if you were to ask them, I think what they would say most directly is that they want to increase the earnings of workers and then make the real cost of living lower in that way. We can get into as we get into specific policy areas, we can expand on these things. But I think that would be their general approach
that's
in both cases.
That's great, and yeah, we'll get to each more details. Last question before we go on to specifically to grocery prices. Have either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump done things that has hurt or helped inflation directly with their policies in the past? Like, how can we learn from their track records?
Yeah. So, I mean, I did touch what the Biden administration did by my personal opinion, spending too much money on that third stimulus bill. And then, I mean, there were some other government spending packages they did as well. But I think
so. Government spending is is up there as being one of the top reasons why inflation would go up or down, essentially.
Or cutting taxes as well. So, I mean, you could say that Trump's previous tax cuts could have also contributed to inflation as well. And then, I mean, the most inflationary things that Trump has proposed, which we'll get into later, are his tariff policies. He's proposing, if I recall correctly, a 20% across-the-board tariff. That's a tax on imported goods. And then also a 60% tariff on goods imported from China.
Wow, that's huge.
And then another thing that they're proposing that would affect prices is they do want to deport all unauthorized immigrants in the country. And those are people working that would make labor more scarce and then would increase the prices. Of course, immigration policy isn't just about economics. There are a lot of cultural and political things as well. So we can expand on this more once you want to get to those specific issues.
Yeah, and let's start getting more specific now. So that was kind of the general overview. Let's talk about grocery prices specifically. We touched on it a minute ago, but I'd say rising grocery prices are hitting everyone hard, myself included. I mean, we're going to the grocery store, like eggs are crazy expensive, right?
Yeah.
So what can we do to lower the cost of groceries? And how are the candidates specifically saying that they will specifically lower the price of groceries? And how directly?
So I mean, I think grocery price inflation is more related to inflation in general. I don't think there's been any policy mistakes that have been happening that would affect grocery prices so specifically. Now, in terms of what they're proposing, again, Harris wants to pass laws that make what she would call price gouging illegal, which is it would give the government discretion to say, okay, these grocery chains and grocery stores are raising prices too excessively, and they want to curtail that. So one thing about prices is that when they're allowed to operate, they generally reflect scarcity, either how expensive it is, the combination of how expensive it is to produce, and then how much people want that.
Right.
And so that's just supply and demand, in other words.
Can I interrupt about the price gouging?
Yeah.
And I might change my tune once I learn more from you guys, but I'm definitely a person who is an advocate for a truly free market. And if a market were truly free and competition was there in its purest form to be able to help reduce or rise prices depending on the scarcity of goods, how can price gouging even happen? Like if there are monopolies in place and one company is monopolizing an entire market, then sure, they can price gouge and it should be regulated. But if antitrust laws were doing what they were supposed to do and regulate monopolies, then a true market would be able to create this competition and would eliminate the need for price gouging because competition would drive prices down.
Right. I don't see, in groceries in particular, I don't think price gouging is actually much of a problem.
Yeah, no,
because it's a fairly competitive industry.
Yeah. Now, that's not to say that there isn't pockets of concentration issues where they've tried to protect their interests. For example, one of the current issues that's happening with, let's say, the meat industry is actually packing, right? There's a lot of concentration in the packing industry. So we have a ton of suppliers of things like beef, right? Lots of different, like farmers and et cetera that are actually feedlot owners that are actually on the supply side for, let's say, cattle for beef. right? But they're selling only to I think there's only 4 packers out there right now, right? And now the packers themselves are also selling to many, 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 many different buyers. So you have this concentration. It's concentration on the buyers from, let's say, the beef producers themselves, right? As well as concentration on the seller side when it comes to, let's say, the grocery stores that buy their meat from Tyson Foods and those sort of things. Now that there's pockets of that I know that a lot of people have discussed some problems with concentration and those sort of things, but that would be a specific, let's say, good versus if you're looking at a market-wide problem, right?
When you say pockets, you're talking about areas
like the good, that specific good, like
Right.
meat, right? Especially beef,
because there's so
right?
few packers. Essentially, it's all being funneled through the packers. That's the
Yeah,
idea?
and there's been a lot of accusations that they're leveraging their market power to, one, decrease the price of the beef that they're purchasing, as well as they increase the price of the actual packaged, the actual packaged beef that they're selling to the grocery stores that would go to their butcher and they cut it up for their steaks and those sort of things.
So that would be a place where the price gouging, where controlling the price gouging could benefit.
Yeah,
I think the more typical policy response would be for the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC,
Yeah.
to then to disallow mergers that might happen in that industry, or force larger companies to break up into smaller companies rather than directly dictating the price.
Yeah, or local governments allowing more entry, right? Because I think that's been, and some of these rural states have actually had some discussions in their state legislatures about, hey, we're basically guaranteeing this massive amounts of market power. We have these inane rules that we can go ahead and remove these and make it easier for, let's say, another firm to enter this industry. So there's a 5th and a 6th and a 7th meat packer out there where that competition can now happen, and therefore you would expect that those prices would lower.
Is there anything that that legislation is doing to incentivize these packers to remain solos, solo companies, and not stimulate other companies or incentivize other companies to come into the market? Well,
and a lot of times what they do is that they try to install regulations, right? Or they try to install some sort of barriers to entry, saying that, well, if you're gonna be a packer in the state of Nebraska, well, here's all these, let's say, specifics that you have to meet in order to be able to operate in this industry. Sometimes it makes sense, right? I'm certainly not saying that regulation is always a bad idea, but some of them are purely there just to, even though it's a regulation that may be costly to like a Tyson Foods, okay, but they're willing to pay it as long as that regulation is also costly to a potential entrant. So they never have to worry about, let's say, a startup firm, let's say, entering this industry to be able to compete with them.
And which government body is responsible for making sure that there is a healthy flow of competition between companies and they're not being monopolized?
Well, I mean, what John was saying, let's say the FTC, but
okay.
It's not just the FTC. The state government these state governments can certainly also get in, make sure that, these barriers to entry don't exist or are legitimate versus, let's say, a regulation that's just there just to prevent entry.
Okay. So that covers the Harris campaign as the price gouging that could, in one indirect way, affect grocery prices. What about on the Trump side?
So the policies that I think are going to most affect grocery prices, and probably not in the way that the Trump campaign would like, are that broad-based tariff I was talking to you about. So because there are a lot of grocery products that we import. So again, Trump proposed a 20% tariff on all goods that are imported. And then what the Trump administration would say to this is that if you protect domestic industries, then domestic production could increase
in the longer term.
In the longer term, at least. But then, a couple of objections to that. One, there's just a lot of grocery products that aren't made as well in the U.S. for like climate reasons, for example. So
you said are not
it's not easy. For example, most of our avocados are imported.
Right.
And that's because, places like Mexico have a better climate for making avocados. The same is true of things like bananas. So no matter how large of a tariff you put on those things, you're not going to really be able to have a great American avocado industry relative to the demand for avocados that we have in the U.S. And then, another thing, and then the other policy that he's proposing that would affect grocery prices is the deportation of We don't know the exact number of illegal immigrants in the U.S., but that estimate could range from 11 million to I've seen some estimates as high as 25 million. If you, a lot of those workers disproportionately work in agriculture, so that's going to surely disrupt the supply chain there as well.
So we have something to look on, at least on the not on the on the immigration side. We did have a lot less immigrants in the U.S. during the Trump administration compared. I think it's gone up like 20 million since then. But on the tariff side, we have something to go by because he did have tariffs starting from almost the beginning of his policy of his 10 years president. How did that affect the price of goods and in general? How did those tariffs affect the price of goods during his presidency?
So there have been some pretty good studies on this conducted by economists since, and frankly, it increased the tariffs, increased prices. So to be clear, he placed tariffs on things like washing machines, steel, and a variety of Chinese imports. And so what economists were able to do is that because these were not broad-based tariffs, they were able to compare these industries where the tariffs were placed to other comparable industries where these tariffs were not placed. So for example, you could compare washing machines which had a tariff on them to dishwashers which did not have a tariff on them.
Why is that? Why specific goods and services?
I don't know the exact reasons why those particular ones are put on. But, I think like steel, for example, is just a politically powerful industry that,
Right.
and there's also some like American ethos of producing steel. And then Trump also wanted to have a competitive trade war with China. So that was directly targeted towards China particularly. A few things. So by design, tariffs are meant to increase prices. So they're making it more expensive to import, and therefore that would allow the domestic producers who, in general, with those specific goods wouldn't compete as well with the lower cost imported goods to be able to compete. So then you're going to be buying more domestic products, which are more expensive.
Right.
So that's
again in the short term. That's the argument for it, right?
Yeah.
In the short term. But to go off on a tangent on that, because again, being president for 4 years is not that long of a time, and it might take longer for effects like this to be seen, or the results of certain policy changes to be seen. So how long would say a change on tariffs? Let's just say hypothetically that all goods coming in from China had a tariff placed on them. How long before we would see the stabilization of our goods that are being now produced in the States and for the better? Like, is it in the long term, is America being able to produce, because we're a pretty self-sustaining country minus, avocados and a few, specific things. I think from a standpoint, we can make all the necessary food we need and plants for anything that we need here in the States. So in the long run, how beneficial would it be to have everything made in America and rely on our own economy and our own resources?
Well, generally, so there's always going to be an opportunity cost. So if we're going to be producing one thing domestically, those are workers and resources that could have been going to something else. So it's going to make us poorer in the long run, point blank. Now, there are some particular goods and services that economists would be more open to protecting. And the main reason that they would do that is for national security purposes. So, for example, there's a very good argument to not rely on the Chinese to produce our missiles, our guns and bullets, and then also some other things like computer chips.
Right.
That we'd be in a lot of trouble if we had a conflict with China and they had a control over our access to that. That's one thing, and that's a relatively narrow set of things.
Right.
However, overall, you do want to worry about the Americans as people that have a budget, and generally speaking, getting people cheaper goods and services will allow them to buy those things cheaper, but then also spend that money elsewhere and have other businesses in the U.S.
Yeah, not to mention the income shocks for the industries that we do have a significant comparative advantage that we do export. Just to not to always talk about agriculture, but we have a significant advantage when it comes to, let's say, grains and these sort of things. And if we're actually trying to, let's say, install widespread tariffs on imports, well, more than likely other countries are going to do the same to us, right? Which is all going to hurt our own incomes of individuals in the country. And so it would be it's going to be ramifications are widespread. Let's say that.
Yeah. You can take the man out of Nebraska, but you can't take the Nebraska out of the man. So he will.
That's probably true. Yes.
Anything else you guys want to touch on as far as the price of groceries in the long and short term before we move on to housing costs?
Yeah, I guess I kind of feel that maybe there has been increases in the price of groceries, but I don't know if John would agree with this, or I think we actually do, is that I'm not exactly convinced that this is a specific problem that truly needs to be addressed now. Now, maybe it could have been addressed maybe later on when you did see some of the massive increases in the price of groceries, but it seems like things have really stabilized now, right? Which you would expect, right? You have, a lot of buyers and sellers. You would think that this is a relatively competitive market. It seems like any of these price increases that were happening with food have now gone to whatever the overall inflation level is. I'm not exactly sure there's something that, unless we can go back in time and actually, think of some sort of policy in 2021 that we necessarily need to address now. I think I understand that there's a lot of, let's say, political cachet with that, right, to make these sort of statements. But I don't know if there's necessary. To me, it seems like it's far more likely to do something that would have larger negative ramifications versus, let's say, a positive economic outcome via policy.
Right. Unfortunately for a lot of people, though, the majority of Americans who are making minimum wage, their wages haven't really gone up to keep up with the price of the increase of groceries. So how's, the prices in groceries aren't going to come down now, right? The idea is once inflation's hit and the prices of goods are at X, then they're never going to come down again. Maybe a little bit, but generally speaking. So, as a piano teacher, for example, I've had to personally increase my rates consistently over the last few years, and I've never had to do that pre-pandemic. Yeah. So where people can't and don't have a choice as to what they're getting paid by the hour, they're working minimum wage. How are they? What can be done to help your average person like that? As far as that goes, like what aside from policy to increase their wages, I mean, there's really nothing that can be done on that front.
Well, yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
I mean, if you're concerned about poor people specifically, I mean, you can have redistributive policy. Like, so for example, you could increase the earned income tax credit, which would subsidize their wages further. There are some parts of the country where you potentially could increase the minimum wage to increase some people's take-home pay. But overall, what it would come down to is that you're going to need to have broader policies that encourage economic growth to make people wealthier.
So I'm gonna ask a very, very macro question because this is something that I've always been curious about. If in a truly free market where there was no subsidies from the government but very little regulation, would the competition of certain sectors be enough to drive an increase in wages for your average worker who's working, a job like, say, at the grocery store or at a fast food joint? If there was truly enough competition, would that help? Would their wages increase naturally?
Yeah. So the one key distinction I think we should make would be the difference between the free market versus, let's say, a very competitive market where there's lots of different suppliers and lots of different buyers. Right. For example, I'm sure it's free market, let's say, mechanisms that cause concentration in the packing industry, right? However, that's not necessarily a competitive market, right? You actually had some consolidation and now you only have a handful of packers. Now, the key in terms of competition would be if there's competition on, let's say, the product side. I'm curious what John would say about this. He's far He's far more learned when it comes to, let's say, labor. But there's also needs to be competition on that labor side, right? Is there a number of, let's say, firms that want these individuals? Is there a lot of competition to drive up the wages because these firms have to compete based on that wage?
Right.
Which is why, right now when you drive around the area here, right, you see that, let's say, places that were maybe offering close to the federal minimum wage, which is Texas's minimum wage, is the federal minimum wage. Maybe in 2015 we're offering $7.25, let's say, an hour to go ahead and work at like a McDonald's. And now these minimum wages are like 14, 15, 16 because they have to compete for these workers.
Right. There's less workers, right? The workers left during the pandemic. They left, fast food joints, the market kind of changed in that sense. And and the way with, Grubhub and these delivery services definitely changed how the pay was being distributed. So I saw people at Chipotle, offering $14, $15 an hour for wages. And
I guess to build off of that, to build off of what John said, just because the market is free and it's, let's say, economically efficient doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be aspects of it that rub up against, let's say, our ideals of morality and ethics, right? So talking about, let's say, redistributive programs like John was referring to. And in fact, in economics, we have something called the second fundamental welfare theorem of economics, which is basically saying that if you have a redistributive program and you let the market run, you can still find these efficient outcomes. And so so it's something where I feel like it can certainly, now whatever policy needs to be implemented to achieve that, I'll leave that to the politicians, right? But it's not something that I would say rubs up against, let's say, the economic ideas of, let's say, a well-functioning economy.
Right. Yeah. Just to bring it all back and make it a little more succinct among what we're saying. We wouldn't necessarily say that it's a lack of regulation or a free market per se. What you'd really be striving for is a competitive market. So on the labor side as well, if there's only one employer in town, then that one employer isn't going to have to compete for the workers, and then it's going to pay them lower wages. So in a place like Dallas, I don't really think that's too big of a problem if, there's a lot of different employers that need to compete for all the workers around here. However, there are a lot of places in I guess more rural or even suburban areas where there are relatively few employers, and therefore wages are going to be more stagnant. So that is a place where government could step in, either to make the ground more fertile for collective bargaining, maybe unions in some contexts, or use redistributive policies to bolster workers' incomes, where the market isn't sufficiently competitive enough.
Yeah. I think there's a balance, unfortunately, in the long run when it comes to government subsidies, because if there's people that need help, the government, we want the government to be able to help them, but there's always unforeseen consequences. For example, student loans and subsidized loans with the school. I mean, that's a big reason why tuition is the price that it is, and why it's skyrocketed, where my tuition where I went to SMU is like more than double than what it was when I was there. So these unforeseen consequences of government policy or changes or subsidies that, welfare as an example, it has its pros, but it has its cons. And there's no perfect answer in an ideal world.
Well, there's trade-offs, right?
Yeah,
and that's like the first lesson of Econ 101, right?
Yeah.
Is that you just have to understand the trade-offs that you're looking at. Yeah, no, it's one thing to maybe add on to this, maybe to just to quick wrap this up, is it sounds like we're kind of protective of prices. Well, there's a reason for that, is that in economics, the prices aren't just some sort of number, right? They convey, let's say, a lot of information about, let's say, what's the aggregate, let's say, need of the good, right? High prices oftentimes can be indicative that we need more entry in the market, right? This is like a decentralized system, and if there's a higher price, you would hope that would induce, let's say, entry into a market because it's a good that people want, right? You don't have a high price for something that nobody cares about, right? You have high prices where there's a massive need. So distorting that signaling ability of prices is in terms of economics, viewed as, let's say, concerning versus, say, don't maybe distort the signaling ability of prices, maybe do something else to allow individuals to be able to purchase food more easily and those sort of things.
That makes sense. That's a great way to wrap it up. Let's move on to taxes. So you'd mentioned a little bit about that earlier. A lot of people are feeling the pinch from from taxes, and is either candidate proposing tax changes that might mean paying less in taxes for middle and working class families?
The biggest tax policy on the table is extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. So basically, that was a widespread tax cut. Most people across the income distribution experienced a tax cut on net.
And this was one of Trump's policies?
Yeah, one of Trump's policies.
Okay.
Now, for how the rules of the Senate work, they could only make these policies go through to 2025. So whoever the next president is will face the decision along with Congress on whether to extend these tax cuts and which particular parts of it to extend. So Trump would naturally, you would assume, would want to extend all of it because it's his policy. And Harris has proposed to extend all those tax cuts for anyone making less than $400,000 a year.
Okay.
In terms of other taxes in general, Harris has a few proposals. One is to expand the earned income tax credit, which for those listeners that don't know is basically a tax credit that if you earn under a certain level of income and you work a certain amount, then it's basically through the tax system, it supplements your take-home pay and makes your tax burden less.
Is there a cutoff for that as well? What do you know? An income?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head because it depends on. Well, first off, it changes year to year based on inflation, but then it also depends on things like how many children you have or other dependents, whether you're married, so on and so forth.
Okay. And then what about tax deductions for homeownership, healthcare, or childcare? Are there any in that realm for either?
So both candidates want to expand the child tax credit. I think the Trump-Vance proposal is either $5,000 or $6,000, so that's per child. You get that, and then Harris generally wants to do that as well. But I think she wanted to increase it the most. I think up to $6,000 in the first year of the child's life. And then were there any others that?
Nothing really. Yeah, it seems like the idea of tax cuts is almost taking a bit of a back seat, right, in terms of some of the other talking points. And so it's that sounds succinct. I mean, the thing about taxes is that taxes can be used as think of it. Let's say taxes. If you think taxes is a hammer, right, then everything looks like a nail. So almost any problem you can try to, let's say, think of tax as a tool to try to curb.
I think it's part of it, right? Like for example, like you're saying, there's some policies that are being that will be tax policies that will help, but then there's other policies, like say in the the Affordable Care Act, for example, the expansion of that and continuing to help people save money on their monthly costs, not necessarily, obviously taxes are involved in that, but they're not paying less necessarily in taxes. You're just getting some sort of a reduction in price for their health care. Or I know that Harris has proposed a few, I'm trying to remember the ones for homeownership, for new homeowners. There's
right. So that's I'm not sure if that's implemented through the tax policy.
It's not.
What she's proposing is that for first-time home buyers, it would be $25,000 for a down payment.
So, which would be subsidized by the government, $25,000. Yes. That's a huge, incentive. If you can, most people can't even afford to put anything down. If they have $25,000 plus, extra 5 or 10 grand to put down on a house, that's a huge incentive for them to buy a house.
But so at first order, yes, though I'm not a fan of that policy because so if you're selling your house and you knew that suddenly everyone had $25,000 more to spend, what would you do? You'd raise the price of your house.
There's those unforeseen consequences that you talked about.
So most economists that study the housing market generally think that the main problem is that it's too hard to build housing. I think both candidates have discussed this in some ways, but frankly, there's only so much the federal government can do. So I think on that part of it, Harris, for example, has talked about making it easier to permit building on federally owned land. But overall, and then she also talked about expanding tax credits for developers. It's called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, to expand tax credits for developers based off of making housing making lower rent buildings involved. But there's been some recent research showing that only really generally changes where developers build rather than actually increasing the overall supply of housing. Now, what actually would increase the overall supply of housing is reducing regulations on where you can build and how much you can build. Unfortunately for presidential candidates, that's mostly done at the local level. So city, state, and local governments have a lot more control over those policies. So we're looking at things, for example, like there are a lot of policies that say you need to have a certain size plot of land to build a house on, and you can't fill up that entire plot. So that's going to naturally restrict how much you can build. There are large restrictions in many cities on how tall you can build a building. The taller you build a building, the more apartments you can have in it, for example. And then there's a lot of requirements that you need to have a certain number of parking spots nearby, or you need to have a certain size driveway. And these regulations have increased dramatically over the past 50 years. And as a result, we've had a large growth in population and a growth in the housing supply that has very far lagged behind. So most economists that study housing would agree that it's generally been a supply problem rather than a demand problem. I don't really see much that from either candidate that would really fix that problem. The Trump-Vance proposal, they argue that their deportation policy would decrease demand for housing and therefore lower housing prices, which, I mean, maybe on some margin could work. I mean, so there are studies that in some cases show that if there are fewer immigrants, there's less demand for housing and housing prices are lower, but it's not really the largest thing affecting housing prices. And then there's the second order effect there where, again, it would be a labor supply issue. So there are a lot of unauthorized immigrants in construction. And if you're going to deport a lot of people, then you're suddenly going to have many fewer workers in that industry.
I want to keep talking about housing costs too, since while we're on the topic, but before we do, let's wrap up with the taxes. Is there anything, are there any, so the tax bracket and the tax plan as it is now, the taxes that I've been paying for the last 4 years have all been a result of Trump's tax plan from 2017, is that correct? So nothing's really changed that during the Biden-Harris administration, is that
correct?
Okay.
And yeah, it's currently Harris's proposal that unless you make more than $400,000, she's not going to propose taxes. So that would be the vast majority of Americans.
What about the argument that Donald Trump is raising tax or lowering taxes for corporations, and then Harris's argument that we need to increase taxes for corporate taxes so that we can use them to help others? Like how is that? What are their talking points in that respect?
Well, okay, so I mean, Harris, being a politician of the left, would put more emphasis on putting taxes that are targeted towards the rich, and in this respect, those on the right side of the aisle would be more inclined towards the argument that when you lower taxes on corporations, it makes corporations have more of an incentive to locate to the U.S. and keep their businesses in the U.S. And that will increase economic growth and help workers in that way. Now, one general point in economics to point out is that when you place a tax on somebody, it's not necessarily the person that is legally supposed to pay the tax through the law that actually ends up paying the tax at the end of the day. So, for example, if you place a tax on a corporation, one thing it could do is that the shareholders, the owners of the company, could end up paying some of that. But what they could also do is decrease pay or increase it less over time than they would have otherwise. And then the incidence of that tax then falls on the workers. And the economists that have studied corporate taxes in particular have found that there is a sizable chunk of corporate taxes that are actually borne by the workers. Now, shareholders do pay some of it too, but that's not going to get you as much juice as you might imagine if you're just going to raise.
So what's the general consensus among you guys and economists in general as far as like how much taxes that large corporations need to pay? Where's like the sweet spot?
I will keep it internationally competitive. So I would say, I mean, so you can raise some revenue off of it, but I would not want a corporate tax rate that is higher than other competing countries.
Well, isn't the tax rate in say like France like astronomical compared to that of the States? I'm not sure. I know for like your average person it is.
Yeah. Well, and I know internationally there's some wild differences in terms of corporate tax rates. Even places that have a pretty generous let's say, Social Security or let's say social network or social net.
Yeah.
And so safety net, sorry, going to get the word out. But I know there's a lot of differences, but it's like, for example, some of the countries that have a very generous social safety net, they actually primarily accrue their taxes from, let's say, the actual wages of individuals, right? I think it's the workers' wages that are heavily taxed, right? Versus, let's say, corporate taxes could be relatively low, actually, right? But it's actually the workers' taxes that mainly support that.
Well, because a principle in the economics of taxation is that you can actually only really get so much from taxing the rich. You can generate revenue off of that, and there's also moral concerns about fairness.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, in order to raise more money, you need to have a broader tax base. You need to actually be having many taxable units to generate a lot of income. So both candidates have actually avoided talking about what would increase government debt the most over the course of the next few decades, which is Social Security and Medicare.
Yeah. In fact, a cynic would probably say that many of the proposed increases in taxes that even come from, let's say, the Harris camp would be more in terms of projecting that I am the enemy of these individuals. This is versus, let's say, sound policies that I'm actually attacking individuals who, let's say, my support base would view as
It's like
the bad guys.
It's an emotional play.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
Versus something that, hey, now we're going to tax this. This is going to be this pool of money that we can use, et cetera. Right? And so.
And then also, also get the other side there as well. Like, so the Trump campaign is far, far, far more optimistic about their ability to raise revenue on tariffs than almost any economist that studies it would be. So frankly, if you look at the countries with generous social safety nets, like the Scandinavian countries, they do, and a lot of the other Western European countries, they have their citizens, including the middle tax, just tend to pay higher taxes. Any plan that mathematically makes sense to be able to pay our increasing Social Security burden and the interest on that, as well as Medicare, is going to involve things that are politically unpopular across the aisle. In order to get the math to add up, you probably will have to raise taxes on the middle class at some point. Whether we do that sooner or later, which I mean, any person that's going to be elected for 4 years is going to opt for later.
Yeah.
Right.
That's why debt is
it's
so
going to happen.
popular.
So in Denmark or any other Scandinavian country, for example, they do get a lot in government benefits, but they also pay pretty high taxes in the middle class, and they're happy with that because they feel like they get a good bang for their buck on that. And then most European countries have a high tax on consumption. So, in other words, a high national sales tax. They call it a value-added tax, where they're paying a lot more than us in America do, but then they receive more government benefits, and and then, frankly, there's going to need to be some adjustments on the spending side as well with these entitlements. So that would include things like increasing the retirement age, and then some proposals I've seen that
taxing unrealized capital gains. Right?
Yeah, that
those sort of topics. Yeah.
Yeah, and then things like that, and then also reducing benefits for people that are higher on the income scale in order to preserve them for people that are lower on the income scale. And then I guess there was actually a big part of the Trump tax plan that I neglected to mention, and that's so Trump has proposed to eliminate taxes on tips.
Oh, right.
As well as to eliminate taxes on Social Security income and eliminate taxes on overtime hours.
I heard that Harris also after that
she did the tips thing.
Did the tips thing? Okay.
Yeah, she also decided to propose that policy as well. Now, so I mean, those are all politically popular and nice sounding things to do, but that's also something that all three of those, tips, Social Security, and overtime, that economists generally wouldn't like. We generally like a simpler tax code where you're going to have a broader group of people paying some kind of manageable amount of tax, rather than just placing taxes all over the system, creating all sorts of unintended consequences or different incentives.
And more convolution too, right?
So, to take the tax on tips, for example. Okay, so what are employers going to do in their negotiations with their workers? They're going to shift as many positions as possible to things that have tips, and then we're going to lose a lot of revenue. So for overtime hours, for example, do you really want to incentivize more overtime hours? That sounds like a very perverse incentive.
Explain to me how would the no tax on tips? Sorry, could you explain that again? How that's going to affect like the take home pay of a waiter, for example, if a business owner were to change? Like, how can they manipulate that tax code to their advantage as a business owner?
Well, so. You could decrease the actual non-tipped wages that they would be paying, and then you might for different kinds of businesses you might switch more workers to tip positions.
But as a waiter, I know that you can't get paid less than like $2.14, right, or something like that.
Yeah, there would be some laws on that, but I think in some places they get paid more than that, and then you would shift away from that for sure, and then. I think in the short term that might increase some waiters' take-home pay,
right?
But then that's going to create a lot of revenue problems for the government that would probably decrease their overall well-being in the long run.
Yeah, and not to mention just the idea it's a vertical equity issue, right? Where it's like why give individuals, waiter or waitresses, right, this tax break versus other people in the same income strata will not have that.
I would say from a waiter's perspective, because most of them are making $2.14 an hour, most of their money is coming from tips. They're able to basically have to pay less in tips because so much of their income's coming from tips.
Sure.
Which actually, I guess I would argue. I guess you would argue for there being less of an incentive to create that law because they're already making money off of income that they don't necessarily need to declare or that's taxed. I'm not sure how that really affects them actually from a tax perspective.
And really all I was trying to say on that would be just in the sense that if you think that there is a group of people that need help, right, and things like that, it's like why would necessarily, to me it seems like there should be help that should be much more broad-based versus something that would be specific tips.
Why are you necessarily valuing the waiter over the McDonald's worker who's
not making tips?
Who's not making tips.
Right.
Although I understand that there's differences in terms of, let's say, the actual wages per hour, but in the aggregate with the tips plus, let's say, the whatever wage whatever is like the minimum wage for like waiters or waitresses, I imagine that there's some sort of level that's going to be equivalent. Right. And so.
Right. Before we move on from taxes, I want to talk more on, again, big scale thing. We've been in a deficit since Clinton, right? And the majority of government taxes is where the government's making their money. Essentially, that's where they have the money on paper to be able to spend.
Yeah.
you think?
Yeah.
That's the general consensus. So what can we do to get into a surplus like we were in the late 90s? Why were we in a surplus then, and why are we not today? And then also on the state level, why is a state like Texas in a surplus whereas California is in a deficit? And how much of that is related to tax?
Well, a lot of it actually.
Okay.
Because it's one of those things, actually getting to what John was saying earlier, debt is so attractive because if you think about the lifespan of a politician at 2 terms, right, maybe 5-10 years, if you could pay things with debt, right, the debt is coming from, let's say comes from whatever sources it comes from, bonds, whatever, right? And that, well, I can go ahead and pay for this now with debt, with the idea that my, whoever follows me in this position will actually have to pay it off, right? And so it's clearly a politically attractive component of this. Now, the one thing about debt and deficits you always have to be careful with is that I think we've actually had a debt for a long time now there has been, and the debt is basically just the pool of money that we owe, like the U.S. government owes. Right. The deficit is actually kind of like a per year.
Right.
Yes. And you're right that Clinton actually, so some of those Clinton years, especially during the .com boom, right? The government budget was actually in the black, right? They weren't running deficits for that while, even though we still had, let's say, some measure of debt. To me, it sounds like when I'm studying debt topics that I have studied, I think the big concern, and this is actually coupled with, all these things are so interrelated, some of the concerns about now that the debt that we have, because interest rates have gone up, the debt is now much more expensive than it was before. Now, how much of that is a concern? You'll see some macroeconomists talk about that. Well, when you look at, let's say, the amount of debt relative to our overall economy size, let's say GDP and those sort of things, we're not nearly as leveraged as plenty of other places. So we could still absorb quite a bit more debt than we have. But I know it's more and more an actual discussion. And
most economists wouldn't find it necessary, nor even perhaps even desirable, to get just zero debt. Yeah, what they would want to do is keep it at a size that's stable relative to the size of our economy. Because ultimately what it comes down to is that if lenders see our country as a reliable borrower, meaning that's we keep our debt. We keep our debt relatively stable relative to the size of our country, then they'll keep on lending to us. And
right, it's just like a bank. If they see that you have some debt, it's going to help your credit. Yeah. But why is, for example, California in a deficit, whereas where Texas is in a surplus?
Yeah, so California has a very odd, well, I don't know if it's necessarily that odd, but it's definitely different than Texas, how they fund their government. A lot of California relies on a lot of, let's say, corporate profits to tax that funds a lot of their budget, right? And so you think about a state like California, they have a lot of large tech monopolies, right? You would make obscene profits, right? And when things are going well, right, you taxing these profits, you'll have these massive surpluses, right? But when the tech industry was struggling, let's say a year or two after when we first started shutting down because of COVID, right, a lot of those profits really started to shrink, and all of a sudden they had those issues because a lot of their revenue is dependent on, let's say, those corporate profits. Okay, which in some ways it's even kind of a perverse way to think of it too, because if you're really dependent on really high corporate profits, well, one way to have really high corporate profits would be to have monopoly power and higher prices. And it's sometimes you can kind of view some of these mechanisms working against themselves, right? If you're trying to, let's say, lower prices and have a freer, more competitive market, well, if you have a budget that really depends on really high corporate profits, well, that's kind of a problem, right? Versus, say, like, for example, agriculture tends to be an industry where we see a lot of competition in that, right? That really shrinks those margins. And we like, overall, if you think about in the long term, in terms of the price of food relative to budgets, it's like a fraction of what it used to be, let's say 50, 60 years ago, much less like 100 years ago, due to technological innovation in agriculture, right? Now, states that are maybe heavily ag, right? They're not finding these massive profits. They don't have these massive profit margins. And so their budgets tend to be, more dependent on things like maybe property taxes and those sort of things. Now, what that means about Texas, I'm not exactly sure, but I know for California, because they were so heavily dependent on corporate profits when those corporations that were located in California, when they struggled, all of a sudden that really shrank their amount of revenue generation.
I mean, it's not a function of how much money they're generating from taxes. It's more about how much they're spending, though, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the California is spending more money than they're making at the end of the day, right?
And but it certainly can be both.
Yeah, So revenue and spending are going to be more important. Yeah, so California is a higher service state that just spends more on social services in general. Mm-hmm. And then, there's also, I'm not really sure how much this matters in terms of their budget. But, the fact that we build a lot more efficiently here in Texas.
Yeah, we have fewer barriers.
So,
less regulation.
And it's easier to get permits to build things. Again, I haven't looked at the numbers to see how much of this is actually affecting California's budget deficit. But for example, they've been trying to build a high-speed rail in California for several years now, and they allocated a large sum of money. I don't have the number off the top of my head. And last I read about it, there had been barely any of it built after years and years.
Yeah.
So
there's some inefficiency there going on. Sure.
Yeah, because just because you spend a lot on services doesn't necessarily mean that the price is the same for those services, right? California may be spending quite a bit, right? Quite a bit more than, let's say, a place like Texas on services. But if the price of providing those services is quite a bit higher than California, well, when the rubber meets the road, right? Well, are people necessarily benefiting from that? And I'm not necessarily taking a pot shot at California in this case. In fact, I don't exactly know if the price of services is wildly different. But you always got to be careful, just like eyeballing the budget, saying, oh, they provide more for their citizens versus this state versus this state. It's like, well, how far does that dollar really go in providing the services that people would, let's say, want to need?
And
it's a tough one.
I'm bringing up California and Texas specifically because there has been almost like a mass exodus, both from like wealthy financial tech, Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, Tesla. They've relocated to Austin, to Texas, and it's just been booming. I know personally a lot of people that have moved from California to here. So what are the incentives why are people coming to Texas? Not just specifically from California, but from other states.
Well, I think the main reason is housing. Maybe not Elon Musk and Joe Rogan. I'm sure they can afford a house anywhere.
Sure.
But most of that, I would say, is that so Texas is a relatively thriving economy overall, with a lot of desirable things like good cities and the like. And most people can, or many more people can afford to buy a house there compared to California.
Yeah, and you actually get to the other areas, right? Part of the argument, not just California. And I know it's almost like we almost had this dichotomy between Texas and California, two ways of looking at the world. But when you look at, let's say, people who come from other areas, what it seems like what's Texas's secret to success is, like, for example, when we were, let's say, young, right? You would talk to some Midwesterner and maybe they would be like, gosh, I really would love to live in Chicago someday or something like that, right? And it's interesting how much that has, let's say, changed, where now it seems like the pool of, let's say, like a place like Iowa State, like, let's say, a high quality engineer who just graduated with their BS from Iowa State. Now places like Austin is a much more of a pull than, let's say, even places like Chicago or the Minneapolis of the world, right? And sometimes I almost kind of wonder if maybe we overrate. I mean, I know there is a massive amount of Californians, and housing has a lot to do with it, but it's also just this long run trend where Texas is now this player in so many other parts of the country, pulling people in, and it's part of its housing, but it's also the economy and how dynamic that is.
I really do think a lot of it is based off of building both houses and other construction projects. I mean, we're in the Dallas area right now. I don't know where all your listeners are, but if you drive around where we are right now, you'll see construction all over the place.
Yeah, everywhere. It's crazy.
It's these are businesses expanding, and it's also more places to live. And then when you have more housing is cheaper.
And it's easier to expand when you know that housing is cheaper because you know that those individuals will move there, right? That's not a barrier to get talented people from, I guess I don't know why I'm using Iowa State as my frame of reference, but a high quality Iowa State grad who has a degree in whatever, right?
Right. All right. Let's shift gears. Is there anything from on the housing cost market? We actually went from taxes to housing too, and you just kind of finished it off with it. Is there anything else in the housing market that either candidates plan tackles to help with housing in any way that could make a difference?
Well,
the $25,000 one you mentioned.
yeah.
Obviously.
So yeah, which is something I wouldn't be too big of a fan of. And I also, I mean, so again, there's a lot of reasons to talk about immigration, but I don't think that's really something that's going to make a big dent.
You're talking about Trump's,
Trump,
his kind of policy on that,
in housing policy,
or his argument.
So I mean, frankly, since it's so much in the hands of state and local governments, there are only a few policy levers that the federal government has that can really make a difference in that. Now, one interesting proposal I saw, which neither candidate is proposing at this point, is to use the federal government's leverage on other things to get state and local governments to decrease regulations in building. Most famously, the federal government back in the 60s wanted states to raise the federal to raise their drinking ages up to 21. What decade was this in?
This would have been 80s actually.
It would have been the 80s. I said 60s. I meant the 80s. So then what they did is a lot of state and local governments get a lot of money from the federal government for their highways. And what the federal government did is they said, if you don't raise your drinking age, then you're not going to get those federal highway funds.
Yeah. They did the same thing with the speed limit. When the speed limit was lowered to 55, that was a similar tactic.
Are there any tactics at play for this upcoming election that are similar to those?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was one of the best housing economists out there. His name's Edward Glaser at Harvard. He wrote an editorial in the New York Times proposing that the federal government induces local governments to have more sensible housing regulations by using a tactic like that. But other than that, it's mostly decided at the local level.
Right. State level. Okay, great. So let's move on from housing and let's go over to tariffs and trade policies. So Trump's obviously, what's the Harris administration want to do as far as tariffs and trade?
So one thing that Trump himself will point out a lot is that the Biden-Harris administration kept in place most of the new tariffs that Trump proposed. Now, I don't believe she's proposing any more, and she's come out on attack towards Trump for his proposal to make those tariffs more broadly. But I mean, I wouldn't call her a free trader herself now. And so, I mean, there's a few problems with that. I mean, so one, as I mentioned earlier, it will increase the costs of these particular goods and services directly. However, another part of this is that, a lot of domestic manufacturers use imported goods to produce what they're making. So take the most recent Trump tariffs. He placed a tariff on washing machines, and he also placed a heavier tariff on steel. Now, steel goes into washing machines. So when you're placing a tariff on both of those things, particularly on steel, you're going to increase the cost to domestic washing machine manufacturers through that, and that's part of the reason why that some of the most recent studies on the Trump tariffs have actually shown that there wasn't really much of an increase in manufacturing employment in those affected industries, and then it was coupled with higher prices, so it didn't really even achieve its intended outcomes.
I'm going to talk about cars for a second when it comes to tariffs and trade. In the States, I've traveled all over the world, grew up overseas. In the States, you see cars from all over the world. You see Japanese automakers, German automakers. When you go to Germany, when you go to France, you don't see Ford. You don't see, and so my question is, and you might not know the answer to this, but why are we not exporting our cars, specifically the way we're importing them? And would a tariff placed on autos help the American car industry grow?
That's a great question. I know historically there has been a heavy amount of protectionism when it comes to automobiles. And so this wouldn't be just the US. This would also include pretty much any of these industrialized countries putting in a lot of tariffs to favor their own automobile manufacturing, right? And so it's really interesting if you take this long view when it comes to trade. NAFTA, I don't know if people quite understand how much of NAFTA was kind of this unicorn, where it was
the North American Free Trade Agreement,
passed
in the 1990s between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
Yeah,
which would allow us to trade without tax free, essentially, or without tariffs.
Basically, yeah. Except for I think there were some agricultural goods that were exempt from that, but it was basically just allowing for trade between Canada and Mexico. And in reality, much trade when it comes to how these things actually work is really quite piecemeal, where you almost have this weird dyadic where, like, for example, I know that when it comes to, let's say, the U.S. and Japan, they would usually have this situation where if Japanese, let's say, lower their tariffs on beef imports, the U.S. would lower their tariffs on car imports, right? It would be kind of these odd
quid pro quo.
Yeah, but that's exactly right? Where versus, let's say, NAFTA was just, we're just these two nations or these three nations, and we just go ahead and let this decentralized nature of it, just let the businesses and the firms figure it out. Now, the couple, let's say the automobile question, you're right? For example, now, like in France, it's all Renault and Citroën. If I'm pronouncing these right, I don't know if I am, but
close enough. Yeah,
right. But now I know that it doesn't necessarily mean that these may be brands, because automobile industry is famous for this, where they have many brands under this larger umbrella. GM, right, has a billion of them. So I don't know if many of these, let's say, original French companies may have actually now been purchased by a U.S. Like, for example, I don't know if Ford may own like Citroën or something like that down the road. But I wonder a little bit about that. But I guess just to go ahead and wrap it back up, I think the automobile industry, because historically it's been always viewed as an industry that's been viewed, our automobile industry has had a ton of protectionism that other countries have duplicated that. Therefore, you start seeing these. Versus the U.S., you see maybe more of it, but a lot of countries, you just see the domestic manufacturers.
Right. So I would envision it being an incentive for us to, I don't know what the tariffs are in other countries. I would imagine that if people aren't importing cars from America, there's a reason why. There's an incentive for them not to be doing it, whether it's by just the amount of cars that we have shipped over there. So my idea is from just to keep things on a fair level. Like I would much rather us have the ability to buy cars from the States and have more options for cars than by imposing tariffs on other countries that are making a lot of money from the money that Americans are spending on automobiles. And there might be more at play than that, but that's just on a surface level. That's what it seems like to me.
I know one other thing too with the Europeans' environmental standards. It seems like historically Europe has tried to deal with issues of, let's say, climate change from a standpoint of maybe not necessarily through the EV and electric vehicles, but a lot of times they really favor diesel engines over gasoline engines, which most of all we have is gasoline engines really in the US, because the diesel engine, from what I understand, is actually the more efficient engine. The problem with diesel is that it also emits more particulates, and it's actually dirtier on other ways, even though it may be an actual more efficient engine in terms of, taking the actual gasoline and actually making CO2 out of it, or I shouldn't say, that's not actually it. It's the fact that the diesel molecule has more energy when it does combust, and that's how it's more efficient. And so maybe it's just because these European car manufacturers have focused on making a high quality diesel engine that meets the regs of the European environmental agencies, right? And therefore we were put at a disadvantage because we stayed with, let's say, gasoline engines. Although, admittedly, maybe that was a good idea, but there's also other.
Yeah, there could be a lot of that play in that respect. So So you think tariffs in the long run are a bad idea?
Yes.
How about you?
Again, except for maybe some specific industries that are vital for national security.
Yeah. And really you think about tariffs, how dangerous they can be, right? I mean, right now, China is producing an EV vehicle that would easily sell at, you talk about lowering prices for consumers that could easily undercut many of the vehicles that we could produce that would be an EV vehicle, right? I mean, they can do it very, very cheaply. Now, how they got there, well, there's maybe reasons, right?
Yeah.
But it's like you think if you're going to try to combat something like climate change, if you're going to have tariffs and that, well, now with Chinese EV vehicles are basically for de facto been banned, right, in the U.S. It's like, well, I mean, look at all these other problems that, something like this would be very handy to have in our marketplace to try to reduce.
And there's, also, you could say that things like EVs do kind of are kind of on the borderline of so does this fit the threshold of national security? Would we really want to be relying if there was some broader crisis, like say China invades Taiwan, if we really want our strategy to be so deeply on decarbonization, so deeply invested in Chinese vehicles? So that's one of those cases where it straddles the line. I've seen Biden,
but there's a trade-off there, right?
There absolutely is.
I mean, that's the.
I've definitely seen the Biden-Harris administration struggling with this as well. When they just when with the Inflation Reduction Act, when they heavily favored domestic electric vehicles over Chinese electric vehicles, they got a lot of pushback from the people that are more focused on climate change. But then also, there were a lot of business and worker interest in the U.S. that liked them favoring American autos over them. So,
and I don't want to get too have too much to get too nationalistic in that sense that but at the same time, being America, we should be looking out for our own interests before the interests of other countries. And when China is manufacturing probably cheaper EVs, but with a much larger carbon footprint, because their regulations are so much lower than ours when it comes to energy production and manufacturing. They can circumvent. They can use coal and not worry about. And there's no regulation on that front when it comes to clean energy, or much less than in the States for sure. So you'd have to ask yourself, and that's where the tariff can be used as a de-incentivization for us to buy those cars because we are looking out for the interests of our country in the long run. So there's kind of in that, like you said, there's a trade-off. In my view, there's also a trade-off in that world as well.
Of course, yeah.
Let's move on to immigration. So, or is there anything else we want to touch base on the tariff side, tariffs and trades, before we move on?
Not that I can think of.
Okay. Yeah. So on the immigration side, how do you think Trump's and Harris's policies on immigration will affect the economy overall? So obviously, the Trump campaign wants to immediately kick out all illegal immigrants basically on day one. Let's just say they could do that. Let's just say hypothetically, if that happens on day one and we had 25 million illegal immigrants leaving the country, how would that affect our economy?
Because I would want to raise the issue that's practically, even if you agreed to do it, that would be very practically hard to do.
Right. The only thing we could do at this point is maybe police the border a lot harder than we have been. But as far as getting them out, I don't.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's But okay, assuming that we could just theoretically do that. Well, okay. So first off, so that's upward of perhaps upward of 10 million workers out of the economy right away. So that would be a very disruptive thing. First off, it would surely increase prices because if you're going to just drastically reduce the labor force by that size, labor will be a lot more expensive, and most things do take labor, so that would make prices go up by a lot. And frankly, you could eventually businesses could eventually adjust in some ways to smooth this over, but this sudden loss in such a large portion of our labor force would be very costly.
Right. In the immediate future, it'd be a big hit to everybody's pocketbooks for sure.
And then there's a point that JD Vance likes to make a lot, that there are I think the number is 7 million men that are in working age that are out of the labor force, and he thinks that then these higher wages from the large ejection of all these immigrants would induce people to work. I'm not so sure that would be the case, because when government agencies survey people who are not in the labor force, they ask you why you're not in the labor force, and a very small percentage of these people actually say that it's because, I think somewhere near 10%, it's because they're looking for a job and they gave up looking for a job. There's a large portion of them that might have some disability of some sort, or they're just doing other things. So it's not clear how many of those people could be induced to go back in the labor force right away, or even in a longer term situation.
Yeah, there's also some of these additional effects of things like business churn, right? Where I know that economists at the Fed, specifically even at the Dallas Fed, have found that. So when you actually limit, let's say, undocumented worker immigration, right? What happens is that there's fewer startup companies, right? There's fewer, let's say, entrepreneurial activities in an economy. Economies tend to stagnate a little bit more, right? There's issues of, let's say, a business that was, let's say, had to go out of business, let's say, a little bit quicker without these individuals. And so when you think about, let's say, the success of a market economy, a lot of it has to do with, let's say, new businesses popping up, new ideas coming to the forefront, new products. And if that stagnates, that's also a significant problem for an economy. So,
can increased immigration put extra demand on public services like schools, healthcare, and housing? And so, how do those policies address or support those services so they can remain accessible for everyone?
Mm-hmm. So,
we can take each one individually if you want, but schools, healthcare, and housing, and how increased immigration can put an extra demand on those services.
So I think a big part of this would be the speed of immigration that would affect these things. I mean, because these things, you can't just build a new school overnight. So I mean, when we saw a bunch of people come over the border, then they got bused to random parts of the country. I guess not quite random. They were targeted parts of the country. Mm-hmm. To make a political point, then you would naturally see a lot of these places struggling to deal with that influx. So one definitely desirable goal in immigration policy, regardless of where you stand on the exact level of immigrants you'd want in, is you would want it to be at a more regulated, steady flow, and not just these sudden bursts here and there.
Right, and I guess
because like all the things you mentioned, such as schooling systems, housing, there was one more thing you mentioned,
healthcare.
Healthcare.
Yeah.
I mean, these are a lot of things that you could scale up over time if you're having more immigrants, and then in fact you'd have more people to help service those things.
Right. And sorry, the argument, I guess, for the Trump side is that there's the influx of immigrants that are coming aren't necessarily skilled traders, are not highly educated, people coming in to help benefit our country, right? That's the argument, and as to why we want to, why he wants to get rid of immigrants. What do we want in America as far as that goes to help grow the economy as much as possible? Because we want immigrants to come, obviously through legal pathways, but we want but we need skilled laborers. We need, less skilled laborers, all types of types of labor. And so what's the right amount, and how do you, from an economic standpoint, forget, from a policy standpoint, how to enact it, but what's the right amount to be able to have the economy grow how we want it to grow?
John, what's the right amount?
Yeah, I know that's a very...
The one thing to maybe add to what you were saying, one of the massive benefits of immigration, even if it's, let's say, low-skilled workers, I know some people have issues with that term, but just to use it for this case, low-skilled, is that there's a lot of complementaries when it comes to the labor market, right? That low-skilled workers are not only, let's say, working that given job, and whatever their production is whatever their contribution is to the economy, but it helps higher-skilled workers also be more productive, right? I mean, you think all sorts of research out there about, let's say, people with high levels of education, their productivity is increased given, let's say, the prevalence of, let's say, lower skilled workers where they can hire to do certain tasks and things like that. There's all sorts of complementaries in there.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's just it's just high, quote unquote, higher skilled workers.
Sure. Yeah.
So, for example, there is a large debate within economics to which degree lower skilled immigrants, particularly from Latin America, are either substitutes, direct competition, or complements to existing U.S. workers. So, for example, I think the example that a lot of people would have in their head is like the more educated worker then getting to direct a lot of lower skilled workers, but due to things like language barriers, that's not even really the case, where having a larger workforce in general could help out domestic workers. So for example, I just bought a house and the house is older, so there are a lot of things that need to be done with that. So we had the movers, we had we had some things to do with our plumbing, our kitchen, so on and so forth. But in all these cases, most of the teams where there'd be a U.S. native who was the leader of the team, and then there would be other immigrants who were great hard workers, but they didn't speak English as well. You would need to be able to pair up immigrants with native U.S. English speakers to then have the most effective teams. So you could probably even say that these people were allowing these construction companies or these moving companies to expand their operations by having larger teams and provide a more effective product. And then there's the other side that, immigrants are not just, in pure economic terms, immigrants are not just workers, they're also consumers as well. So when you have a higher population, there's more people demanding goods and services, and that's going to create jobs. There's a lot of research kind of trying to tease through the question of when you have a lot of immigrants come in, what's the effect on U.S. natives' wages and employment? All the evidence doesn't point in one way, but my read is that the preponderance of evidence is that these complementarities and these demand increases do generally increase the vast majority of workers' wages. Now, that's not going to be always the case. There are some studies that go the other way, so I'm not going to say that it's so clear. It is a difficult thing to measure, and there are a lot of things you need to tease out through it.
Yeah, and I think when they do find, and let me know if I'm wrong on this, but I think when they do find, let's say, some straining of, let's say, social services or something like that, because immigration, oftentimes it's usually just the border towns, like in Eagle Pass, Texas, where all of a sudden they bear, let's say, if there's a very large migration to the U.S., their services are being really strained. But as the undocumented workers, let's say as they fuse through the greater U.S., they usually don't find these straining of services, I think, like in a Milwaukee, Wisconsin or something like that. Mm. Is that correct? I think that's what the findings
I guess my personal qualm with immigration as it has been in the last 4 years, where there has been a large influx of immigrants, it hasn't been going through a vigorous vetting process. So if, for example, on an economic standpoint, you have economists saying, okay, we need more skilled laborers in this sector, then we can let's let in more people that are skilled in this trade or this craft into it to help stimulate the economy or help us with growth. So when there's a concerted effort to bring in immigrants to help the economy in one way or another, I'm totally for, and I think most people would be for. The only issue is when there are people coming in that can't be vetted, that we don't know, what their skills are, and we don't know how that will affect the economy. We can say because we don't know how they can contribute to the economy, I guess you would say.
Mm. Yeah, so I mean, you definitely want to vet people for a lot of different reasons. I don't think anyone's ideal world is that we'd have a lot of just unvetted, unauthorized immigration.
Yeah,
so
we should know who's here. I agree.
Yeah, okay, there might be some people that really view like open borders or whatever, but I think most people, if they might be talking to their political base or whatever, but I think most people given truth serum would say yes. Regardless of what level of immigration we're having, we would want people to be vetted. Now, it's very hard ex ante to know where exactly immigrants are going to be needed. Because business owners kind of know their own needs, and it's very hard for some planner in Washington to be able to say, okay, we need this many, this kind of immigrant, this many, this kind of immigrant. So, I mean, generally speaking, you would want to let, so well vetted people into the country, and then if there's demand for them, then they'll be able to find jobs.
Well,
and then
you mentioned housing being and there being a need for less regulation and just a need for more growth. And the reason why people have come to Texas is because we've been able to grow and manufacture. So you take that as an idea and say, okay, well, in say California, if we were to expand and build more, maybe that would incentivize people to come here. Well, then for us to build, we might need we might need some structural engineers, or we might and if we can find structural engineers and vet structural engineers from other countries that can help with that burden, then that could be an example.
Yeah, so you could definitely have visas for high skilled individuals that could let people in. Whether you like Trump or not, he does say a lot of different random things. So it's always hard to say exactly what his proposed policy would be. But on one of his days, he did say that in order to get more high skilled workers in, what he might be in favor of is if you are an international student who graduates from a U.S. college or university, you can get a green card. That would surely increase the amount of skilled workers, which would include all the structural engineers you're talking about. I think pretty substantially, and my personal opinion is that would be a very good thing for economic growth. Another policy that's constraining us from bringing in high skilled workers is what's called country caps in our green card system. So there's only a certain number of the total green cards that can go to a specific country in each year that's passed. So this means that
that's silly.
From countries that have a lot of immigrants coming into the U.S., there's usually a long line to wait. So think about countries like India or China, where there are a lot of skilled workers that would love to come into the U.S. Because there are so many Indians and Chinese already coming to the U.S., a lot of those people have to wait to get a green card. They might be able to come in on some temporary things, but in general, there are a lot more of those skilled people that we're not letting in because of that country cap. That's something that I would be heavily in favor of eliminating. And I briefly this morning tried to see if either of the candidates had a stance on that particular issue. I couldn't find it right away, so I would stand to be corrected if there. And I wouldn't be surprised if either candidate supported that particular part of it as well.
As far as I think it's safe to say that both candidates aren't necessarily open to open borders exactly, especially Trump, obviously. But on the Harris side, I guess my concern is a lot of the rhetoric in that campaign has been more about hasn't addressed the illegal immigration that has happened in the last 4 years. And so for me, that personally is one thing that's yes, they want to do something to curtail it, but there's nothing that's been explicitly stated as to how they'll do it, and also why there's been an influx in illegal immigration. Because it's safe to say that I'm for immigration legally. I think, and I'd say your average American is for that as well. It's just. I'm part of me is openly, obviously, I'm skeptical about how that's happened in the last 4 years and how there has been a large influx of illegal immigration come in. So we'll see how that plays on the economy. But I'd say let's move forward and talk about just a general recap of everything.
Just to make a general note on immigration, Malcolm and I are both trying very hard to just talk about it with our economist caps on and very kind of like precisely talk about economic effects. But it's really worth noting that that's not the only issue with immigration in general. Because you're not just having workers come in here, you're having people come in here, and how they're coming in, whether it's through a system that's that's illegally, and the people that are currently in the country would see that as illegitimate. That's that's a real political and moral concern. And then when you have the culture around you being changed by newcomers, that's also something that's, a concern that many people have that's worth taking seriously. Now, we're economists, so we're just trying to stick to our lane as much, but I don't want to say that I'm dismissing any of those concerns that other people might have at all.
That makes sense, yeah.
No, and I understand that. I I think the thing about immigration, when you try to talk about it in this comprehensive economic sense, I can understand the viewpoints that some people can go ahead and that have. For example, you look at, let's say, the roofer, the labor supply of roofers for Texas, primarily undocumented workers. You go to places like, especially historically, like in Minneapolis, Minnesota, or like in Milwaukee, and these are union jobs making $35 an hour, right? And so people would say, well, clearly there's some substitution in this case, and so people can come to that conclusion, maybe not realizing that, well, with immigration, there's all these other additional economic effects that could, even though, let's say, yes, they're maybe paid at lower wages and then those sort of things, yet there's all these other benefits that can come from that. And these things are far more harder to, let's say, disentangle versus the obvious, these are just different labor pools. So it's a tough question, and I can understand where people come to those conclusions, probably why, why a lot of Trump's messages seems to resonate with so many people.
Yeah, no doubt.
All right, let's recap everything before we wrap it up. When we put all these policies together on inflation, groceries, housing, and trade, what are the main pros and cons of each candidate's approach?
So putting all these things together. So I think you've probably heard that, Malcolm and I have both been relatively critical of both candidates. And I kind of want to return to what I was saying at the beginning, that a lot of what we're given here to critique are political promises that are designed to be sound bites in campaigns. So generally speaking, I'm more optimistic about what either candidate would actually end up implementing when faced with the constraints of reality, and then the natural fact that like either person entering the Oval Office is going to enter either with the opposing party holding Congress,
right,
or at very most a narrow majority. So there's going to need to be a lot of practical concessions.
Right.
So some things that I've called impractical.
And so, we can loosely take what's happened in the last 8 years, because we have a slight track record to go by, as opposed to being a completely new political candidates, right? Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Keep going.
For sure. So I really personally see housing and housing costs as something that should be at the forefront of policy. And I don't really see either candidate doing something that I think would fundamentally address that. So that's something that I would like both of them to do better on. I am glad, though, to hear both sides talking about how supply is a problem. And I've definitely seen the Harris side talk about that a lot as well. More so than a lot of Democrats have in the past. Because I will say that like Harris is talking about it more on the campaign right now. So I guess what she's saying rhetorically is a little more satisfying to me, but then it's also, to try and be neutral, bipartisan about it. If you look at the actual local places that are doing better on this front, in my opinion, they tend to be redder places. So, some of the worst housing policy examples all come from blue cities and blue states. So,
like what, for example, as far as policy goes?
So New York and San Francisco have all sorts of regulations that don't allow people to build. All these things like building height restrictions, minimum lot sizes, parking lot requirements. The list goes on. All these things about keeping housing expensive for the people that already live there and thus want to keep their values up, and not allowing working and middle class people to enter these desirable places.
Sorry to piggyback on that real quick. I guess the idea of the left versus right, there's also this overarching philosophy of government regulation and involvement. And I would say that those people who tend to lean libertarian or more independent, or I'd say libertarian, that want as little government intervention as possible, which would include regulation, tend to vote red. Red. So it does make sense that there's going to be more regulation on the left side than on the right when it comes to that.
And I think there is becoming more of a consensus on that actually in this particular area there needs to be less regulation. So that's one thing I'm optimistic on, actually, though the candidates aren't directly proposing things that I think would be so helpful in that regard.
Well, and just the nature of economic growth, right? And this comes from Adam Smith all the way up to today, that a lot of it is primarily in the sense of it's hard to flip a switch and now we got growth, right? It's one of these things that it's like more in terms of if you have a market-based system and you have these decentralized agents, right? They're going to be able to figure out where best to use like their capital and their resources to go ahead and, let's say, promote economic growth. And they're doing this because there's a profit mechanism. So in terms of, let's say, sets of policies, it's almost like which one's more out of the way in some ways, which I know is leading to the idea, the libertarian idea of it, but which one has, let's say, less of an impact of actually, let's say, not, or which one is going to go ahead and, let's say, allow just the natural economic growth process to happen versus, let's say, something that would undermine it.
Right, like the regulations in housing that you mentioned. Yeah. Any other thoughts as far as that goes? No.
Oh, housing, we could talk for another couple hours.
Right.
We could definitely talk about that, but I don't think that would be beyond the scope of.
So assuming that the candidates' policies are enacted, let's assume they can pass these. For middle class families and lower incomes who are hit the hardest, which candidates' policies might be better for easing those costs?
Certainly, if Trump's policies are enacted, I have a tough time seeing that, like food prices would not dramatically increase, which would, and it
because
would be
of the tariffs.
Yeah. And it would not be, it would not be, let's say, a store or an immigration. And it wouldn't be, let's say, like a stylized food choice or anything like that, or designer food that may come from like a Whole Foods or something like that. But let's say, just fundamental foodstuffs, right? That would be, I would have a hard time thinking that those prices would not be significantly affected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I'd say, but
well, I guess like heavily manufactured food, I guess you could say, or because
it's. I guess I would just say more like food basics would see some sort of price increase, and especially for the groups that you're talking about, right? Lower income individuals, middle class. I don't know what you would say about that, but.
It's hard. It's hard because you have to also think about what the consumer is buying. Because I think when someone's, I think about what I consume and what I eat. I would put myself in middle class for sure. I like to eat healthy, but from a personal standpoint, I like to avoid processed foods. And I would say the majority of the food that I consume, I'm not getting from anywhere but the States, right? And when you think, avocados being, one exception. There's a few like bananas. Bananas are dirt cheap. I don't know. We could maybe create a farm somewhere. I think the conditions for bananas are very easy to grow, right? I'm not sure if there's any other products like that, but I would say I think we are self-sustaining enough agriculturally that we don't really need to rely too much on outside countries, but I don't know. I can't see all the ins and outs.
Well, certainly from an immigration standpoint, much of the labor pool I realize that it's heavily mechanized in places like the Midwest, right? But California is still very much of a labor intensive process. And if those labor costs go up significantly, that could have an impact on, but I would assume a wide range of, let's say, food items that could be out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a very broad
and I'm not
brush.
trying to argue
Agreed.
that cauliflower is going to be $10 I don't know, what is that, a flower, I suppose?
Right. Yeah.
Right. I'm not arguing that, but I can see that having some sort of impact, right? On and I'm trying to get at, let's say, eggs. You have egg processing plants, right? And the workforce for those individuals, if the labor costs dramatically go up, that could maybe have an impact on something basic like eggs and things like that, or even packing, right? Meat packing has a labor force that's predominantly undocumented workers, and so.
Yeah. And then, so with regard to grocery prices. I mean, I was also pretty harshly critical of Harris's price gouging proposal. So I really don't see anything so much to like there as well. And then there's a general.
And this would be if they actually enacted everything they've been promising, right? Which we don't think anybody would really.
Yeah, and this is why it's a little hard to talk about. Like, so as David said, like, I mean, they're implementing two different strategies right now. Like, I mean, I think Trump is kind of more brashly trying to be himself. And then, so that's kind of also leaving more things to criticize. Where, I mean, like a lot of Harris's campaign strategies to like intentionally moderate and say do things less. Like, I mean, like, you know, if we were talking about 2019 Kamala Harris's economic platform, there'd be a lot more low-hanging fruit for us to pick on. No pun intended, given what we've been talking about.
What were some of her policies that?
So depending on which day you got her, you'd have her doing things like abolishing private health insurance, for example, which would be also incredibly disruptive. Like, you know, really on the scale of a lot of things we're talking about with Trump as well. That's one really prominent example I have in my head.
Yeah, I mean, and these were examples, or these were policies that she was talking about when she was just trying to win her primary.
Yeah, right.
And so where they're trying to cater to a very leftish side, right, versus let's say trying to move to a more central response now that she's actually running for president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, if I have to answer that question one way or another, just on pure economics. Like, I guess since Harris is proposing less, I would say Harris as proposed, but that's a very I wouldn't really take that as an endorsement.
It's very hard because it's hard to really understand what is actually more possible. Is it Trump's more, I guess, for lack of a better word, more extreme policies? Although I think Trump is more of a true believer in those policies versus Harris being something that she's saying just to get elected. And then if she actually makes it to the Oval Office, what would she actually do?
Yeah.
Right. So I guess if you would say so just purely on economic policy if you could just say what their current platforms are as implemented, I'd probably go with the Harris.
Yeah.
But then like if you're going to talk about practical politics though, I think a lot of the things that Harris is proposing that I don't like are more likely to get actually implemented as stated.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Than a lot of the things I don't like with Trump as much. I'm skeptical that there, for example, really will be like mass deportation and and like a 20% across the board tariff. I'm skeptical if that's going to actually happen.
Yeah. I think from all we have to go with, like I mentioned earlier about the immigration, is that there has been an unprecedented amount of immigration in the last 4 years as opposed to before. There was still immigration. There's still illegal immigrants coming through, but at least policing the border better as far as that could.
So we do have a track record on that. Yeah, there were far fewer border crossings under the Trump administration than the Biden-Harris administration.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, you guys are making this easy for me as far as making my decision and anybody voting. But it goes to show that like how multifaceted this is, and how it's not just a one quick answer or a soundbite like you put it earlier.
Yeah. And there's just so much outside of. There's so much outside of just pure economic policy that like are really important things to vote on.
Yeah, of course.
You know, like we're also like I have voted. I'm not gonna say who I voted for, but a lot of my primary considerations didn't even come up in this conversation today because it's not purely economic.
And I would say that our window of what we're trying to analyze is actually relatively short, in the sense that there's some long run ramifications that I'm almost kind of tabling because there's a lot of uncertainty in these sort of cases, right? Where when it comes to, let's say, you know, how aggressive should we be with China, right? I mean, sure, maybe there is this benefit of cheaper cars or cheaper EVs if we open up the borders with China, but does that mean you have a stronger autocratic government that doesn't necessarily have a reputation of being, let's say, the biggest friend of the U.S. or many countries out there, right? And so, and just keeping it narrow to just the economics and economic policies, you're really, I mean, we're all tabling all these larger political, let's say, ramifications of this. And so, yeah, it's tough.
Yeah. Well, guys, yeah, no, I think
I don't know what to do about China.
Yeah, right. This is just the economic side of it is just one part, or the fiscal policies you'd say is just one part of the whole. But it's also interconnected, and I'd say at the end of the day, a lot of people are. I mean, I read through in preparation. I read through the Harris Waltz plan. And there's a lot of good in there. And, I voted, I'm a pretty transparent guy, and I've said this before, but in 2016, I voted for Bernie in the primaries, voted for Hillary in 2016, and then I voted for Trump in 2020. So it goes to show you how I've
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
But reading the policies for the Harris Waltz, proposed policies, there's a lot of good in there. And I went in there with the closed mind, but I'm always trying to go in, or I went in there with an open mind, having already been kind of flipped and flopped, and I'm always trying to go in there with an open mind. And like you said, if every policy could be enacted on that piece of paper that I read, I'd be happy with a lot of it. My concern is just that, for me personally, the track record of the last 4 years and why a lot of that hasn't been enacted. Now, granted, she wasn't president, so that and I don't know how much of that played a role in it, but I'm still like you guys say, there's so many other parts to this puzzle that this is just a small little piece. So I really appreciate you guys coming, lending your expertise, and helping me kind of and my audience just kind of wrap their heads around this multifaceted kind of thing.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I appreciate it, guys.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.